how different strains of cannabis are just like certain types of food. Now follow me on this example. You can get steak from restaurant A, you can get steak from restaurant B, go get steak grass-fed from some local farm, pay top dollar for it. Now, you're going to have a whole entire different experience with all three of these steaks. Let's say restaurant A is Applebee's. Let's say restaurant B is Mastro's Steakhouse. And let's say, like I said, the home cooked one is the best grass-fed local meat you could buy. Now, let's just level the playing field. Let's say the exact same chef were to cook all three steaks at all three settings. Still, you're going to notice a taste difference because Applebee's is going to be buying the cheapest steaks. Mastro's is going to still have high quality steaks, but they might not be grass-fed and local. And then your home cooked is going to be grass-fed and local, and you're going to be using local ingredients to cook with it, most likely completely fresh. And if it's a good chef preparing it, it's going to come out good. So my point being is you can still cook an Applebee's steak with the same ingredients as the grass-fed homemade steak. However, they're not going to taste the same. And it's similar to cannabis, is you can have a strain of weed, let's call it OG Kush. You can have OG Kush grown here, you can have OG Kush grown here, you can have OG Kush grown here. Now, the example of grass-fed meat, cheap meat, mid-range meat, not grass-fed, whatever. These are different types of, we'll call it genetics in a sense. So we're saying, okay, what's your starting material? What are you using as ingredients? Now, let's say you have really good OG genetics, which is similar to some grass-fed steak versus some just off-the-shelf random OG. So my point is, it's going to come down to genetics. It's going to come down to the ingredients you're using. And then lastly, it's going to come down to the person cooking the food. So in the example I used, I just said, let's have the same chef do all the cooking to make, an even comparison. But let's go a step further. And let's say you really go to these different restaurants and it's different chefs cooking it, and it's different settings and environments and different ingredients. Every single steak you have is going to be completely different. You're going to have an amazing experience with one or two of those steaks, and then most likely a disappointing experience with at least one. Now, I explain all this to make the point that just because you have a cannabis strain one time and you don't like it, doesn't mean you don't like that strain. It could mean that, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that, because it's just like you going to Applebee's, having an overcooked, poorly cheap ingredient steak, overcooked, and you eat it and you're like, oh man, this tastes horrible. Who'd ever eat steak like this? Why? I'm never going to eat steak again. You know what I mean? So it's like you have one bad food experience. It doesn't mean that you're never going to eat steak again. So if you smoked OG and you're like, oh, I didn't like how that OG was, a lot of people will be like, oh, I don't smoke OG. Or it's the same thing with even just smoking weed. I've met a lot of people who choose not to smoke weed because it's made them paranoid in the past early days of their life or something. And this could specifically, it's shown that different types of strains as well as your endocannabinoid system all interact differently, so you have a different effect. So them feeling paranoid back in the day could have just been some cheap weed or some weed, the wrong strain or wrong type of smoking method, the wrong environment. So all these variables, and then they're accounting that one time as like, oh, I don't smoke weed. So that would be like saying you go out to eat and you have a bad meal, and then you're like, oh, I'm never going out to eat again. And it just doesn't happen like that. And also, another direct comparison is you could go to the same restaurant 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and you could have a slightly different experience each time. One, the food might taste amazing. The next, it might be a little bit not quite as good. The next time, it might be good again. The next time, it might be worse. Like all these variables, and it's just like growing weed, is you're going to have one batch that could be amazing. The next batch might be a little off somehow. The next batch might be a little darker or greener or whatever. So every batch is different. I look at it like a human. You're not going to go have a bunch of kids and everyone's going to grow the same, or every year they're going to grow the same way, so it's like different things happen, environments change, external circumstances happen. To wrap up this video, I just want to make the point that if you've tried either a specific strain or even just smoking cannabis and it hasn't been a good experience and it's turned you off from it, reconsider, potentially look at trying some different strains or exploring some different consumption methods, or test it out in other ways. Maybe try getting some different brand strains. If you got OG from this brand, maybe try from this brand or whatever, or maybe try a different strain. These are all part of the process. It's part of, just like if you move to a new town, you're going to go try different restaurants, and there's going to be some you go into one time and never walk back into again. But there's also going to be ones that you go into and you're like, wow, this is amazing. I'm coming back here. I'm going to tell my friends about it. And then there's also the ones that it's like, oh, it's okay. I got the job done. I got a burrito. It wasn't the best, but it got me full. And so we have the whole spectrum, and cannabis is just like food in so many ways. especially in the marketing, the sales, the quality, what people pay for, what people want, what people expect, and then more so the consistency, or I should say lack of consistency, because we're talking about nature here. We're growing products, we're growing plants. My other comparisons with food, you're growing meat. It's basically a living being that every time is going to be different. So just wanted to shed some light on that, point out these things in the industry, and just something for you to understand as a consumer, even if you're just a consumer, that strains are extremely, extremely important to how your body reacts to the cannabis. And I should clarify that strains are only this important when smoked. If you do edibles, strains pretty much have no bearing on edibles. So if you come across strain specific edibles, it's kind of a gimmick, because ultimately the strains come from the terpene profiles, not from the cannabinoid profiles. So by not having these pure terpene profiles in the edibles, you're not getting an indica or sativa effect. So it's really just a cannabinoid in the edibles, and it's processed through your CB2 receptors rather than your CB1 receptors. And this is, I got another video about this. Just pay attention to the strains you're smoking and how they make you feel. Don't be afraid to experiment with different strains, different combinations, different smoking methods. This will all affect, on an individual basis. So what works for your friend, what works for your girlfriend, whatever, doesn't necessarily going to work for you. Anyway, thanks for watching. Follow all the social media accounts. Check out my website, hichris.com. There's a lot of great content about how to start, build, and launch your licensed cannabis brand without even having to own the license. Thanks again for watching.